Well, I'm sorry if you're listening to this. I apologize because I know you probably weren't ready for this. But if you're listening to this lecture, this means that either our service day was postponed or canceled or shortened, and now you're sitting in class and you didn't come to school today ready to come to class. So I apologize for that. But we're just going to continue our talk about the Emancipation Proclamation today. Let's take a couple minutes and review. If you recall, the question being asked, who freed the slaves? Most Americans would say Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And why do most Americans say Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? But because of the Emancipation Proclamation that was announced in January of 1863. That proclamation earned him the nickname as the Great Liberator. And then his status or his legacy was increased or raised as a result of his assassination. After his assassination, many people viewed him as a martyr for slavery. Now, is this true? Was Abraham Lincoln the Great Liberator, or is that a misconception in our country's history? Historians agree to disagree. The historians who disagree point out, hey, in 1858 he stated he was opposed to black equality. And then in 1861, when General John C. Fremont freed the slaves in Missouri, Lincoln reversed his decision. And then often he would express being uncomfortable with, when are we going to end slavery and how are we going to end slavery? Both of those questions, hard to explain, or harder to answer those two questions, I should say. Then on the other side, there's historians who say that yes, he was the great liberator because he did believe slavery was morally wrong. And then when he was running for president of the United States, he stated many, many times that he was opposed to the spread of slavery. But before the Civil War, he never said he was opposed to, wanted to eliminate slavery. He said he was opposed to the spread of slavery. And then the Emancipation Proclamation announces that there isn't going to be any slavery anymore. Now, what exactly was this Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln announced? Again, it was issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, and it proclaimed the freedom of slaves in states that were in rebellion. That's the key. It freed slaves in states that were in rebellion. And then it gave those freed men that were qualified the opportunity to join the Union military. Now, why do some people refer to this Emancipation Proclamation as a dead letter? In other words, not meaning much. Well, if you recall from Wednesday, the reason why some people refer to it as a dead letter is because the border states were omitted. The border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, they did not. They were allowed to keep their slaves, and in portions of slave states like West Virginia and Louisiana and Virginia, they were also allowed to keep their slaves. But the main reason why people refer to this as a dead letter is because, well, let's be serious. If you are a slave owner in the South and you've broken away from the United States, are you really going to follow the orders of the President of the United States? Probably not. Remember, 4 million slaves living in the United States. 3 million of those slaves are living in states that are rebelling. In all reality, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed 200,000 of those slaves. You make the call. Was Abraham Lincoln the great liberator? Now, why did Abraham Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? He knew it wasn't going to eliminate slavery. He knew, though, he was planting a seed. And he also did this for 3 reasons. He announced the Emancipation Proclamation to help with diplomacy. The South was calling out to European countries, help us. We need help in our quest to break away from the United States. And there were some European countries considering helping the southern states. But European countries had outlawed slavery decades before. And so would a European country really want to help out the southern states if Abraham Lincoln basically came out and said this war was to end slavery? So Abraham Lincoln thought it would be easier on European countries to say no to the South if they knew that the war was now being fought for 2 reasons: to bring the South back in and to end slavery. President Lincoln also issued the Emancipation Proclamation for political reasons. Remember, the war was only supposed to last 3 months. Almost everybody thought this war was only going to last 3 months, and now we're going on 3 years. There were many people saying, what are we fighting for? Are we fighting just to keep the South in? Let the South go. So by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation saying, hey, no more slavery, now we're fighting, now the North is fighting to end slavery. And then finally, militarily, he said this. Now, many, many reasons why militarily he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. One, it rewarded African American enrollment. It would increase the number of African Americans that enrolled in the military after this proclamation increased tremendously. And then those African Americans that were in before, it kind of rewarded them. Hey, thanks for joining the military. Now, because you joined the military, we're fighting this war to end slavery. So a reward to the African Americans that had already enrolled in the military, and then an incentive to get more African Americans to enroll in the Union military. So diplomacy, politically, militarily, the three reasons why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, when did emancipation actually take place? If it didn't take place under the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, when were the slaves actually freed? Well, folks, it actually came with military conquest. I cannot tell you, and I cannot give you a certain date because there is not a certain date. It all mattered when the Union military took over and gained control of a region of the South. And when they gained control over the region of the South, most military commanders set the slaves free. And then some slaves, because they were worried for their lives, they wanted a new life, would often just follow the military, causing problems for the military. In many cities, you'll hear of a Juneteenth celebrations, because going kind of back to a couple questions ago, are slave owners really going to read and let the slaves know that Abraham Lincoln had set them free? No. Juneteenth goes back to what happened in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, after the Civil War. June 19th, 1865, it was announced, the Emancipation Proclamation was announced in Galveston, Texas, freeing the slaves. And for many slaves, that was the first time they had ever heard of the Emancipation Proclamation. If Lincoln didn't free the slaves, then who did? That's something I bet you're kind of wondering. Well, historians have come to the conclusion, some, not all, some historians said, you know what? You know who freed the slaves? Slaves freed the slaves. Now, what in the world is that? They're slaves. How can they free themselves? Next week, as we read letters and things along that lines, you'll see how some slave owners almost became paranoid during the Civil War, watching their slaves saying, why are they not rebelling? Why are they acting the same? Are they doing that on purpose? What's their ploy? And so slave owners became very conscientious of what was happening during the Civil War, and of course, many of the slaves were able to pick up on that. There was also what slaves would call running to Lincoln's Land, or running to the North, escaping the drudgery of slavery. Now, why is that going to play a role? How's that going to happen? Well, in the South, there was this belief that slavery was actually good. That was a win-win situation, a win for the European Americans, a win for the African Americans, and many slave owners argued, hey, slaves are happy. That's why they're here. We're doing them a favor having them be slaves. And then when the slaves are escaping, that kind of hurts that myth that the slaves were happy. It also drained the South of a workforce. Okay, you have European Americans from the South going off to war, and then you have your African American slaves doing the work, and with some of them leaving, you're draining the workforce in your region. And then again, what did some of those runaway slaves do? They joined the Northern Army. They joined the Union Army. And so it's going to increase the numbers of the Union Army. And then on top of it, by 1863, 10% of the Union Army was African American. And it also changed how European Americans viewed African Americans. 1/3 of African American soldiers were killed in battle or died from disease. So some European Americans started to say, hey, these people, are they equal to us? Maybe they're not equal to us, but they deserve some respect. And then, all right, you're in the South, and you believe that African Americans are inferior to you, and now who's beating you in battles? But soldiers who are African American. It's kind of hurt their morale. Now, what did emancipation mean for many of the African Americans? In all actuality, some are going to say, "Hey, you know what? I'm moving. I don't want to be a slave anymore. I'm out of here." And some freed slaves left their slave owner, left their plantation to find families, or just to get away for a fresh start. Opportunities maybe up north, maybe opportunities in Canada, maybe opportunities out west, just to get away. But in all reality, many of the slaves that left the plantation ultimately came back to their plantation or came back to another plantation because that's what they were familiar with. Also, another thing that emancipation meant for African Americans was being able to reassert gender roles. Remember that in slavery you basically couldn't have families. Families weren't allowed. Husband, wife, children wasn't allowed formally on plantations. So African Americans are going to restart and start families. They're going to take on a surname. While a slave was a slave, slaves didn't have last names. So one of the first things that many slaves did is they changed their name, and they also added on a surname, a last name. And there was this change in attitude. Many African Americans, almost all African Americans, saw themselves kind of like on the bottom rung of society. And this is a chance to rise your social standings. Now, we went through that fairly fast, but I did want to give you an opportunity to hear this information. We'll talk about it more next week when we're together again. I'd like you to take the rest of class and quietly read Chapter 4. Your substitute teacher will give you a reading guide, and the reading guide's also on my website, and I hope you have a great day. Take care. Oh, and they established black churches with African American ministers. Huge. They're not, in other words, their religious leaders are not going to be white. They're not going to be European Americans, but they're going to be just like them. They're going to be African American. Have a good weekend.